We're on Daf Ayin Hey Amud Beis, and on the Mishnah on the bottom of the Amud. We began this Mishnah yesterday, and we still have to complete it today. Yesterday we spoke, if you recall, about 3 different levels of Blia. The first requires Klipa, and that was the case of Noga Becharso Shel Tanur. The second case requires Nitilas Etzba, and that's the case of Notaf Mirotval Acheres V'chazar Elov. And then we have a third case of Notaf Mirotvo Al Hasoles, and that requires Kmitzas Makoma. So we're up to B'Shemen Sacho B'Shemen Shel Truma. So you'll see that 4 lines up before the end of Daf Ayin Hey Amud Beis. Now, initially, the Mishnah is going to describe a case where all the Bnei Chabura who have joined together on this particular Korban Pesach are Kohanim. Kohanim only. No Yisraelim allowed. And Sacho, what they did was they took Shemen Shel Truma and they smeared it on the outside of the lamb before they roasted the lamb. It's a kind of a basting. And I guess it adds a certain taste. So im Chaburas Kohanim, if we're dealing with Chabura and all of those who are registered on this particular Korban Pesach are Kohanim, so therefore Yochelu, they can eat it. There's no problem. But in Shel Yisraelim or Shel Yisrael, if the Chabura is not exclusively made up of Kohanim, so we have Yisraelim, and now you have a Blia of Shemen Shel Truma that is penetrated into the Korban Pesach. And the question is now, is there any way of salvaging this Korban Pesach on behalf of the Bnei Chabura? And the Mishnah says yes. Im Chayu, if he hasn't yet roasted the korban, so it's raw meat, Yad Vichenu, all he has to do is rinse off the shemen, because everything is cold at this point. He hasn't started roasting the korban. And in case of sonein b'tsonein, all you need is hadacha. All you need is to rinse it off in cold water. But im tzlihu, if he adds the shemen after the Korban Pesach was roasted, then the Mishnah establishes that hadacha is not sufficient. Rather, yiglof es hachiton, he's got to do a klipa and remove a thin layer on the outer part of the Korban Pesach. Then that thin layer of the Korban Pesach has to be burned, and he can eat the remainder of the Korban Pesach. This is all a case of Sicha B'Shemen Shel Truma. Now, I have a few notes that I want to share with you. Normally, we're not allowed to be mavashal the Korban Pesach with mashkim or meiperos, but in this case, he's only doing a sicha, so it's not like the liquids are causing the actual roasting of the Korban Pesach, and therefore it's okay. Now, truma is given to a kohen, but in the case of Yisrael, the Torah says, Kol zar lo yochal kodesh, and truma is considered kodesh. There's an entire chapter in Masechet Yevamos that's dedicated to the Isur of zar eating truma. Now, we have to raise the following question. Just simply a question, it's not a kasha, but we have to know when the Mishnah says, im tzlihu, that if the Korban Pesach was already roasted, and now he adds the Shemen Shel Truma, you're going to need Kedei Klipa. Are we talking about a case where the Korban Pesach is still hot, or has it cooled off? When did he add the Shemen? Did he add the Shemen immediately after he roasted the Korban Pesach? It's still sizzling hot, or it already cooled off? So this is the question that Tosfos Dibra Maskil V'im, which is the third Tosfos on the daf, addresses, and he says that it matters not whether he did the Sikh of Shemen when the Pesach was still hot or after it cooled off. Once the basar was roasted, it's called rach, it's called soft meat, and therefore it has a propensity of being bolea. It absorbs even in soneh. And he says, I have a proof of this, because if you can assume that the Mishnah is talking about a case of sicha on a hot piece of meat, kshuroseach, then there's no difference between meat that's raw or meat that's roasted. In any event, you're going to need some sort of a more profound kashering to get rid of the time of truma than just hadach, because even if it's absolutely raw meat, nevertheless, if it's hot, it's going to be boleh. Because the Mishnah made a distinction between chai and sli, it must be talking about a case where it's tsone, it's already cold. So since it's cold and it's raw, it hasn't been cooked, therefore there's no blia and it only needs hadacha. But if it was already roasted, even though it's cold now, the very fact that it's roasted, that gives the meat an ability to be bolea, and therefore it requires kedei klipa, to remove a klipa's worth. So that's as far as Tosfos is concerned, that the requirement of klipa applies to basar tsalui, even if it's cold. However, had it been raw meat, chai, and it's cold, we wouldn't even require klipa. Hadacha would be enough, and that's exactly what the Mishnah says, that imhu chai yadichenu. All he needs is hadacha. Next. Now, sicha b'shemen shel Masechet. And we're in Yerushalayim. And as you know, Ma'aser Sheni has to be brought to Yerushalayim. This is Shemen of Ma'aser Sheni on years 1, 2, 4, and 5 of the Shemitah cycle. And now all the Bnei Chabura here are in the same boat, whether they're Kohanim or Yisraelim. All of them are prohibited from eating this Ma'aser Sheni, let's say Bituma, or of course outside Yerushalayim. What exactly is the Mishnah addressing here? The Mishnah says, Lo yasenu damim al bnei chabura, which means that Lo yitol mi bnei chabura mos tmuras hashemen. In other words, the bnei chabura cannot, let's say, chip in with money and transfer the kedusha of the Ma'aser Sheni over to the money. Now Rashi understands that the subject of this Mishnah, this last part of the Mishnah, is ein mochrin Ma'aser Sheni b'Yerushalayim. In fact, Tosfos has a different girsa in our Mishnah, according to which it says ein mochrin. And we'll try to explain that girsa in a minute. The Bartanura says that even if we accept the girsa as we have in ein podim, nevertheless, Rashi interprets it as ein mochrin. So it's only a question of whether you change the girsa, but the interpretation of the Mishnah remains identical. And ein podim, if we have that girsa, means ein mochrin. Now, what happens with Meiser Sheni in Yerushalayim? Obviously, you're not allowed to be poda it. You have to eat it b'kedusha b'tara. You can only be poda it outside Yerushalayim and bring the most into Yerushalayim. And what about selling Meiser Sheni b'Yerushalayim? I want to give up my Meiser Sheni, sell it on the market, so that the buyer will eat it here in Yerushalayim. So Rashi says, "Ein mochrim Meiser Sheni b'Yerushalayim afilu she'eino rotze lafkia es kedushasa." In other words, the lokeach, the buyer, is going to eat the Meiser Sheni in Yerushalayim. The kedusha still remains, and nevertheless, you cannot sell Meiser Sheni in Yerushalayim. He can eat it. He can give it as a gift, but he cannot sell it. Why? Because the Torah says in Parshas Rei, it says, "V'chi yarbe mimcha derech," you're far away. "V'nasato v'kesev v'tzarta hakesev v'yodecha v'alachta el ha'makom." So he's outside Yerushalayim. He's got to bring the Meiser Sheni and eat it in Yerushalayim. He could be poded with kesef, but only when he's outside of Yerushalayim can he transfer the kedusha of Meiser Sheni onto the most. But in Yerushalayim, he cannot do so. And just as he's not allowed to be poded in Yerushalayim, he's not allowed to sell it in Yerushalayim. That's how Rashi learns our mission. Imunotel b'bnei chabura most tmuras hashemen. That's called mechira. So one of the bnei chabura owns the shemen, in this case of Meiser Sheni. He wants to sell his portion to the other members of the chabura, so that when they do the sicha of Meiser Sheni, they all benefit from that sicha. And he wants to get reimbursed for that. He wants to charge the Bnei Chabura, let them pay for his Meiser Sheni. He cannot do this. Now, we have Tosas Divrei Maskil Lefi, the last Tosas on the Amud, and he raises the following objection. He says that the pasuk itself is referring to a case of what's called Chilul Meiser Sheni, where he transfers the Kedushas Meiser Sheni from the Peiros over to the Mos. That doesn't prove anything about Yerushalayim to establish that you cannot transfer Meiser Sheni and the Kedusha over to Mos. I mean, that I understand that you could derive from the fact that the Torah only allows you to transfer the Kedusha of Peiros Meiser Sheni onto the Mos out of Yerushalayim, implying that in Yerushalayim you cannot. But as far as selling Meiser Sheni Yerushalayim, when the Meiser Sheni retains its Kedusha, how do you know that you can't sell it and the buyer will eat it in Yerushalayim, b'kedushasa? Again, outside of Yerushalayim, the Torah is telling you that if you want to be Machalel, you can be Machalel, implying that you cannot be Machalel in Yerushalayim. But here, we're not talking about, according to Rashi, Chilul Peiros Meiser Sheni. He's not removing the Kedusha. All he's doing is selling it. How do you know it's also to sell it? So Tosas claims that this whole Iser of not selling Meiser Sheni in Yerushalayim is all D'Rabbanan, and it's Xera, because we're afraid that if we allow him to sell Meiser Sheni in Yerushalayim, he might come to be Poda Meiser Sheni in Yerushalayim. The Rashba has a different take on this Gzeira D'Rabbanan. He agrees with Tosas that the Iser of selling Meiser Sheni in Yerushalayim is only D'Rabbanan, but the reason why they made this Gzeira is because of what's called Bizayan HaMitzvah. We don't sell mitzvahs. You have a mitzvah to eat this Meiser Sheni, it's yours. Don't sell it. And then we say that Tosas has a different Girsan of Mishnah, and that's Ein Mochrin. But Tosfos doesn't deny that there is a girs of ein podim, and he says that if you accept the girs as we have it of ein podim, then the Mishnah is asking the following question. Someone wants to take mows from the Bnei Chabura, and he wants to use these mows for the purpose of chilul shemen shel ma'aser on the mows, meaning that the shemen should now be yotzei l'chulin. And you're not allowed to do this because ein podim ma'aser sheni b'Yushalayim. He points out that there's a Mishnah, our Mishnah in Yerushalmi, the gear says ein mocher. But there's an alternative gear of ein podim. Now here, there's a chiddush in the Mefarshe HaYerushalmi. That's the Karban Eda and the Pnei Moshe. And they claim that the Isser of Mechira of Ma'aser Sheni applies not only in Yerushalayim, but even outside Yerushalayim. And therefore the Girsa has to be ein podim Ma'aser Sheni Yerushalayim, because the word Yerushalayim would make no sense if your Girsa would be ein mochrin, because the Isser Mechira applies equally both in Yerushalayim and outside Yerushalayim, as opposed to Chilul or Padiyah, because Padiyah is only an option outside Yerushalayim. So ein podim Ma'aser Sheni Yerushalayim. Comes along the Rivan, and he says that if your girs is ein mocher Ma'aser Sheni Yerushalayim, that Isser only applies in Yerushalayim and not outside Yerushalayim. Outside Yerushalayim, I'm allowed to sell Ma'aser Sheni. And that makes sense if you go with Tosfos, because the whole Isser of Mechira is because we're afraid that you'll be Podeh. Well, if it's outside Yerushalayim, you're allowed to be Podeh your Ma'aser Sheni. The Torah says it explicitly. And so you're allowed to sell your Ma'aser Sheni. Because the whole Isser of selling Ma'aser Sheni, according to Tosfos, is only the Rabbana. So therefore, the Girsa of our Mishnah, if you have ein podim Ma'aser Sheni Yerushalayim, instead you have ein mocher Ma'aser Sheni Yerushalayim, it means it's predicated on the assumption that the Isser of selling Ma'aser Sheni only applies in Yerushalayim, which is against the Karban Eda and the Pnei Moshe. Again, according to the understanding of the Karban Eda and the Pnei Moshe and the Yerushalmi, the Isser of ein mocherin Ma'aser Sheni applies equally to both Yerushalayim and outside Yerushalayim. Now, if you have this girsa of ein mocherin, it means that theoretically you could sell Ma'aser Sheni, but the Rabbanan prohibit it. Can you really sell Ma'aser Sheni? So the Mefarshe Yerushalmi say that girsa of ein mocherin Ma'aser Sheni reflects the shita of Rabbi Meir, who holds that you could be Makadish and Isha with Ma'aser Sheni because Ma'aser Sheni, no, just the opposite. Rabbi Meir holds that Ma'aser Sheni is Momen Gavoah and the Kedushin is invalid. Oh, so then when it says ein mocherin Ma'aser Sheni, and we're saying according to Yerushalmi that applies both in Yerushalayim and outside Yerushalayim, what that means is not that it's also to sell Ma'aser Sheni, but there's no possibility of selling Ma'aser Sheni because Momen Gavoah, you can't sell it. Now, on the Mishnayos in Zroim, like in Masechet Masechet, for example, we have a pirush of the Rash. He writes that Masechet is Mama Gavoa, and if you accept the gears of Ein Mochrin Masechet, it means that whether it's Yerushalayim or outside Yerushalayim, you don't have the ability, you don't have the bilus to sell Masechet. So you have to take out the word Yerushalayim, or at least the word Yerushalayim is Lav Dafka, because you're holding like Rabbi Meir that Mama and Gavoa. So what difference does it make whether you're in Yerushalayim or outside Yerushalayim? So Tosas Yontif here in our Mishnah wants to say that if you have the girsa of Ein Mochrin Ma'aser Sheni, then the word Yerushalayim should be read as Af B'Yerushalayim, not Dafka B'Yerushalayim. That even in Yerushalayim, where you're allowed to eat the Ma'aser Sheni, and therefore you might think that it's your mamon, you own it now for achila purposes, as opposed to Ma'aser Sheni outside of Yerushalayim. In Yerushalayim, it's mamon hejot, that you have your own personal ownership of it. And what that means is that even Rabbi Meir might agree that in Yerushalayim, Ma'aser Sheni is mamon hejot, but the Rabbanan said you're not allowed to sell it. So that outside of Yerushalayim, you cannot sell it. In Yerushalayim, you can sell it, but you're not allowed to sell it. That's the way the Tosas Yontif wants to justify the girs of Ein Mochrin Ma'aser Sheni Yerushalayim. It means that you could sell it, even according to Rabbi Meir, because you're in Yerushalayim where you're allowed to eat the Ma'aser Sheni, that gives you bilus, but you're not allowed to sell it. Either because it's Bizayin Mitzvah, as the Rashba says, or because, as Tos says, we're afraid that you might come to be Poda Ma'aser Sheni in Yerushalayim. Okay. Now we're up to the Gemara. Now, we had the second case in the Mishnah of Notaf Mirotvo Shel Korban Ala Cheres V'Chazar Elof. Now, let's just think, before we get into this gigantic machlokas between Rav and Shmuel, what is the situation here of the Rotef? If we assume, which I think is a pretty fair assumption, that the Rotev is hot and it bounces off the Cheres Shel Tanur, and then goes back into the Korban Pesach. Let's you know what? Let's go through the Gemara. The Gemara says the following. Oh, I see. I'm sorry. He has a little bit of an introduction. When I prepared this, I used a different Gemara. His introduction, he says that Machal shel heter v'shel isa shenaflu zeh al zeh im nivla tama machal ha'asur b'machal ha'mutar nesar v'chein basar v'cholav shenaflu zeh al zeh im nivla tamo shel zeh bozeh nesru shneim. Okay, so we're assuming that tam ki'ika. So tama isur, when it's bolua in heter, generates an isur in the heter. Itma. Cham l'toch cham. If you have Iser and Heter, and they're both hot, and one fell into the other, is Divrei Kol Osir. That's on Ayin Vav Amanah. But Sonein Litoch Sonein, Divrei Kol Mutter. Where's the machlokas between Rav and Shmuel? Cham Litoch Sonein, Vitsonein Litoch Cham, which means that in one of those two cases, Rav is going to say it's Osur, and in the other case, he's going to be Matir, and Shmuel is going to turn it around. So Rav Omar Eloi Gavar, Shmuel Omar Tatoi Gavar. So according to Rav, if the Cham falls into Tzonein, it's Osur. If the Tzonein falls into the Cham, it's Mutter. According to Shmuel, just the reverse. If Cham falls into Tzonein, it's Mutter. And if Tzonein falls into Cham, it's Osur, because Tatoi Gavar. Not. Now let's see how the case of Rotev fits in to this machlokas. Our Mishnah, Tanan, Notaf me Rotvo ala Cheres. So we have now the liquids of the Korban Pesach that have not been roasted, and they bounce off the Cheres. V'chazar Elof, back into the Pesach. Yitol es Makoma. So in other words, we're assuming that there is blia, in this case of Kochim Psulim, into the Korban Pesach. Because Salkadait Gemara thinks right now that Becheres Sonenes, again, exactly why the Gemara assumed that the oven is cooled off, I don't know. But that's the premise. The Gemara says that black and white. So now let's think. If the Cheres is cold and the Rotev is falling onto the Cheres, so we have now a case of Cham L'toch Sonein. Bishlema L'Rav. It works out beautifully according to Rav. The Amari Loi Gavar Mishum Hachi Yitol Es Makomo. We now understand why the Mishnah in this case requires Natilas Hidei Etzba, and why this Rotev penetrates into the Basar HaPesach, Iser B'toch Heter, and it's a case of Eloi Gava. And what makes it Eloi Gava? Because again, Rabbi say, if we require today the Tila, it means that there's some Cham over here, because if everything is Sonein, you don't require Kedei Tila. You could have Hadacha maybe. So we must be talking about something's hot. Now, the only thing that could be hot here is the Rotev, which is fine. But the Rotev didn't go directly into the Korban Pesach. It bounced off the sides of the oven. And now we're assuming, for whatever reason, the sides of the oven are cold. So why would this Rotev present any sort of problem when it goes back into the lamb? It's cold. Why do you require Kedei Tila? The answer is it's not cold. Why? Because of Rav's principle of Eloi Gava, which means that when the hot Rotev falls onto the cold earthenware oven, which is cold, as we said, then instead of the earthenware on the bottom cooling off the Rotev that's coming from on top, which would be Shmuel's principle of Tatoi Gavar, we're going to say just the opposite. That the heat of the Rotev is going to heat up the Cheres Shel Tanur, such that now when the Rotev bounces back into the Korban Pesach, it's Cham, and therefore we're going to require Kedei Tila. But however, so the Gemara actually spells this all out. So Bishlema Rav the Omer, according to Rav Eloi Gavar, is then it works out. Why Mishum Hachi Yitolas Makoma? Why does he need Kidei Klipa? Azal Rotev Umartich Le Lecheres. The Rotev, which is hot, is going to heat up the Cheres. That's based on Rav's principle called Eloi Gavar. Now the Hadar Cheres Umartich Le Rotav. So now that the Cheres is hot, you see, I would say that when the Gemara says Chazar Cheres Umartich Le Rotev, you don't have to translate this Gemara literally. What the Gemara is really saying is that the heat of the Rotev is maintained. Why? Because the Rotev is warming up the Cheres, the Tanur, rather than the opposite. The Tanur is cooling off the Rotev. So if the Cheres shel Tanur, based on Rav's principle Eloi Gomer, is now warm, so then the Rotev still retains its heat. There's nothing to cool off the Rotev. V'chihada Rotev Pesach komitvei Pesach machmas chamimusa decheres. So the Gemara now introduces another element into the equation, and that is, would, according to Rav, who says Eloi Gavar, would that now establish that the Rotev itself is solui? Which again would be a problem, because if the Rotev is solui, then it's a kosher of Pesach, and why should it generate some sort of an Isur in the Pesach when it goes back into the Pesach to require Kidei Netila? But the answer is, what roasts the Pesach? It's the Cheres Shel Tanur. That's very interesting, because it's the Rotev that's hot, the Cheres Shel Tanur is cold, but as a result of the fact that the Rotev falls onto the Cheres, it heats up the Cheres because of Eloi Gavar, and now the Rotev becomes possible. Interesting. Meaning, as long as the Rotev is in its natural raw state, it's not yet possible. It becomes possible when it becomes roasted, because it's roasted by the walls of the Tanur rather than by Eish. So it's not Sli Eish. That's what the Gemara is saying now. Rachmana Omar Tzli Eish, below Tzli Machmas Dovarach. So how does the Rotev become, if I can use this term, a Cheftzah Nisura, meaning Kodshim Psulim? Because it becomes Tzli Machmas Dovarach. It's really interesting how the energy force works there. I mean, you started with a Rotev, and the Rotev heats up the Cheres, and when it bounces off the Cheres, the Rotev is already considered Solui, but it's Tzoli Machmas Dovarach. So all that works out according to Rav, and Eloi Gavar, and we understand very well, we can justify why the Mishnah requires Netilas Klip. El Shmuel Diyomer Tatoi Gavar, Cheres came in the Tzonenu, Ikure Mekar Leila Rotev, is Amayi Tolas Makoma. The Cheres, which is the Tatoi in this case, is cold, and it in turn will cool off the Rotev, which comes and falls on top of the Cheres. And it's not that the Rotev heats up the Cheres. On the contrary, it's the Cheres that cools off the Rotev. Because the Cheres remains cold. There's no power in the Eloi, in the Rotev, to heat up the Cheres. So the cheres remains tzonein. And if it's tzonein, it's not roasting the rotev, and therefore the rotev does not generate an iser on the Pesach. Is a ma'yitolas makomo. According to Shmuel, how do we justify the psak of the Mishnah in the case of rotev requiring kedei tefillah? The rotev is not going to heat up the cheres. On the contrary, the cheres is going to cool off the rotev. And if that be the case, the rotev was never subject to sli. It maintains its original status. So why would it generate an iser of kodshim psulim on the vis-a-vis the lamb itself? So the Gemara says that now we have to reinterpret the Mishnah. Kida Omer Rav Yirmiyah in a different context, as we'll soon see. Omar, he said, in the name of Shmuel, that Besolas Rosachas. Right, the next case in the Mishnah is where the netifa of the rotev fell into soles. The soles on the bottom, if you want to assume that there's going to be an iser here because of the netifa of the rotev, and the Mishnah says he has to be kometz as makomo, it must be that the soles on the bottom is hot and tatoi govar is hochanami. So to here in the case of the rotev, in the previous bava in the Mishnah, becheres roseach, the walls of this earthenware oven are hot, so that when the rotev falls on the walls of the cheres, it retains its heat. It still remains hot. And you could go a step further, as we said earlier, it becomes tzli machmas dover acher. And all this is because the oven is hot, not the way we assumed it in the Hava. Tnan. And now we want to see Rav Sheshes in his original, in his context. Notaf mi rotvo ala soles yikmot es makomo. Once again, basalka daitach soles sonenes. The Gemara now thought that the soles, which is the tatoi, is cold. As Bishlevel Rav, I could justify why the Mishnah requires in this case kmitza, which is like netilas makomo, because the Omer Eloi Gavar is mishum hachi yikmots es makomo. We need to get, to surgically remove the rotev. And why? The answer is the martich la usolas. The rotev which falls down into the soles is called Eloi Gavar, and the rotev is hot. It therefore heats up the soles on the bottom. The hadar hudrane, I guess it means the soles and all that is around where that place where the rotev fell. V'hodjach soles umartech le'ledideh. And now that the rotev heats up the soles now in turn heats up the rotev. V'kamatve rotev machmas chamimusa de soles. Now the rotev becomes heated up, or shall we say roasted, as a result of the heat of the soles. V'rachman amar tzli v'lo tzli machmas tovrach. El Shmuel di Omar. Atoy govar. But according to Shmuel, the soles now, because again, we're assuming the soles sonenes is the soles sonenes is going to cool off the rotev, which is Eloi, and we don't have a process here of tzli. So he says soles keva the sonenesi the ikure ka makerle lamali yikmotes makomo. Why do you have to remove the makom of the soles? We should be matir because the rotev itself is not chal. It was never heated up. Now I know he has here something in parentheses. Tiske le bitul es makomo. Just 1 second here. Do we need those words here? I have it in parentheses. Lamal yikmot es makomo. Tiske le Tiske le biyitol es makomo. No, that's no good. I think we should take out those words. Rashi doesn't have these words. The Gemara should be saying that there's no Isur in the solus at all. And you don't need Kmitza. The Gemara is not saying that all you need is Natila. In fact, I don't know if there's any difference between Kmitza and Natila. So this Girsa of Tiskile B'Yitolos Mekomo makes no sense. Apparently, this Tosis Ella, it's a long Tosis. He tries to justify the Girsa that we don't have, meaning that he had. But in any event, Omar Rabbi Yirmi Omar Shmuel B'Solas Rotzachas. That the case in our Mishnah is where the Tatoi, that's the Solas in our case, is hot. Tnan. Now the Gemara again is going to attack Shmuel from the next Bava in the Mishnah. The Gemara is going to say there through all the different cases in the Mishnah. Sacho b'shemen shel truma im chaburas konim yochlu v'im shel Yisrael im chayhu yidachenu im tzlihu yiklof es hachitzon. Is bishlema lirav the omri loy govar. And now we're talking about the shemen. The shemen becomes the loy now. Is amtu lahachi, I understand very well, sagile b'klipa. You just have to remove the thin film on the outside of the basar, the Pesach, and you can eat the Pesach. Ishum di loy tzonin. The shemen, which obviously, if he's putting it on the outside, smearing it on the outside of the carbon, it must be cold. And what's going to happen is that if we hold like Ravi, like Govar, then the cold shemen is going to cool off the basar. El Shmuel, the Omar Tatoi Govar, Kevon de chamhu umivla boli amai sagi leva klipa nitza legamri. So the tatoi here, in the case of sicha, is the basar pesach, and the assumption is, which is obviously the case because he's roasting the pesach, that the pesach itself is cham. Or it doesn't matter whether it's chamatzoni, but it's certainly a case of cham. So if it's a case of cham, then Shmuel's principle of tatoi govar should kick in at this point, and as a result, the entire Korban Pesach should be also, at least for non-Kohanim, I mean, because it now has a bli of shemen shel truma. Either shemen is cold, it doesn't matter because tatoi govar and the basar pesach, which is tatoi, is going to heat up the truma, the shemen shel truma. So the Gemara answers, Shani sicha de mashu bi alma hu de avidna. He's not adding a major volume of shemen. He's only doing a sicha. It's a very thin film of shemen. And if it's very limited in its volume, in its size, it's a dover muat, then Shmuel is moda that it doesn't generate an iser unless it's, except for klipa, but beyond klipa, even Shmuel would agree in this case, despite the fact that the meat is hot and tatoi govar, all you have to do is take off kedei klipa. Again, what exactly is considered davar muat, I don't know. The Bach says that din zehu kishe'ein v'pesach shir shel mea pa'amim keneged hashemen shel truma shehi ashir shebo truma mispateles. Tanya Kavasi de Shmuel, we have a brisa to support Shmuel. Cham litoch cham osur. Okay, everybody agrees that that's v'tzonin shenosan litoch cham osur. So now we're going to apply the principle of Shmuel tatoi govar. But cham litoch tzonin, if the cham is the loy and the tatoi is tzonin, v'chein tzonin litoch tzonin, is mediach. All you need is hadacha. So cham l'toch tzonen is equal to tzonen l'toch tzonen, and that is a clear-cut support for Shmuel. Gemara now raises the following question: cham l'toch tzonen mediach. 1 second. How can you tell me, even if you apply the principle of tatoi govar of Shmuel, that there's no blia whatsoever, and all you need is hadacha to remove the iser that's on the surface of the tatoi, right? That's Eloi on tatoi. What are you talking about? It's something that's cham. If something cham falls into tzonen, even if I accept Shmuel's principle that the process now is a process of hitztananus, right? Because the Eloi govar, nevertheless, adelo, you remember this. Kevan de chamu, ad mekerle yefshelo bola porta is klipa mi boy. How could the Brisa say that chamu totzonen, all you need is hadacha? You should certainly require netilas klipa. No, I don't mean netilas etzva, but kedei klipa, because although the process that's going on is a cooling process, where the tzonen tatoi is cooling off the cham Eloi, but nevertheless, the moment of contact between the cham on the top and the cold on the bottom, or if you will, between the iser and the heter, there's going to be some surface level of blia here. You can't tell me there's no blia at all. Hadacha means there's no blia. Hadacha means get rid of the end that's film on the outside. But the first level of blia, even if it's only a limited blia, requires klipa. There's got to be some limited blia here, even according to Shmuel, at the moment of contact between the hot Eloi and the cold Tatoi. Ella Ema, he's going to reinterpret the Brisa, and it's Cham L'toch Tzonein Kolev. That's what Shmuel would say in this case. Right? We're holding now Tatoi Govar. The Tatoi is Tzonein. And we require Klipa. Again, even Shmuel would hold the Efshad Lo Bola Purta and Klipa Mia Nibai. We need Klipa. Is therefore Kolev. But Tzonein, L'toch Tzonein, made Diach. So we cannot accept the Girsa of the Bryce as we have it, that Cham L'toch Tzonein is identical with Tzonein L'toch Tzonein, and all you need is Hadacha, because there is a Mixas Blia, which he calls Bala Purta, in the case of Cham L'toch Tzonein. And that's even according to Shmuel. Again, according to Rav, you have a much more far-reaching issue. And Klipa is not going to be enough, because Rav holds Eloi Gava. Tanya Idach. Now we're going to bring another support for Shmuel. Interesting. We started with Tanya Kavase de Shmuel. Now we have Tanya Idach Kishmuel. Basa Roseach should nafal etoch cholav Roseach. Wow. Both say if I saw this happen, I would freak out, right? You got hot meat falling into hot milk. V'chein sonein shenafal l'toch cham. Let's assume, I mean, it doesn't have to be this way, that the meat is cold and it falls into hot milk. Awesome. Which means that we're applying the principle of Shmuel of Tatoi Gova. And the milk, which is Tatoi, is hot. But what about Cham L'toch Sonein? And here we're going to say that the process is one of cooling, but there's still a blia bepurta. Vitzonein L'toch Sonein is Meidiach. Again, we're going to have to change the gears in the second price as well. Because Cham L'toch Tzonein, Meidiach, that doesn't make any sense. Kevi the Chamu Adamekerle, Ef Shalo Bola Purta is Klipa, Miani Boy Ela Ema, Cham L'toch Tzonein. You're going to have to rewrite the Brisa and differentiate between Tzonein and Tzonein, which is only Adach, there's no Bli at all, and Cham L'toch Tzonein, where at least there's a Miktas Blia Purta, and it requires Kolev, Klipa. Tzonein Toch Tzonein Meidia. So you get the impression that we're going to paskin like Shmuel there, Tatoi Gova, which is something that we're familiar with, Tatoi Gova. It has implications even in Masechet Shabbos, as far as Meleches Bishol on Shabbos. Omar Mar, we had a brisa before that Tzonein L'toch Tzonein Meidiach, two cold substances, like you have cold meat that falls into cold milk. You're allowed to eat it. There's no blia. Is Omar Rav Huna Lo Shanu Ela Kishe Lo Milacha. Or Lo Milcho, I would read it. In other words, what happens in a case of two cold foods? One of them is also one is mutter. one's basar, one's cholov. But the bottom one that's cold is also salted. Aval malacho also the Amashmua maliach harehi kiroseach. These are like the ABCs of Yeridea here. We finished the smicha. We're ready to learn chulin. Finish this sugya. So if we apply the principle of moliach hareu kiroseach, then even though the tatoi is sonem, physically it's cold, so we have a tatoi now that's cold but roseach. What does it mean? How can you say it's both cold and roseach at the same time? That's a contradiction. The answer is because it's moluach. And if it's moluach, we apply the principle of moliach harei roseach. And in addition, Shmuel said kavush harei hu kimavushal. So that if you soak it in, let's say, oil or vinegar, it's like bishul. So let's say you took a chatich of heter and a chatich of iser and you soak them together in vinegar. Or alternatively, you took a dvar iser and you soaked it in chometz. Or he put both meat and milk into the same bowl of chometz. In all these cases, it's as if he had cooked them together. And of course, the heter becomes awesome. Omar Rava ha di Omar Shmuel moliach harei kiroseach lo amoron ella shelo nechal machas milcha. There's so much salt that you don't appreciate the taste. Avol nechal machmas milcho. In other words, if there's a limited amount of salt, then we do not apply the principle of moliach hareu kiroseh. Now, how much is nechal machmas milcho? Is this a subjective issue? Every single person will decide for himself whether it's nechal machmas milcho, or is there some sort of objective shira? Maybe we should give it to a kfela. He says that eina kavana she'ein shum adam yachali ochla, but rather niskalkel tamo ad shenimnoy miachilo. So it's so salty that people would not enjoy eating it. You may find somebody who loves over salted meat, and he'll eat it. And Rashi in Masechet Chulin on Daf Kuf Yud Beis identifies Eino Nechal Machmas Milcho with Melicha Sha'osim Lebasar Kidei L'Shomro Liyomim Rab. So basically, in order to appreciate La Halacha L'Maisa, this principle of Rava within the context of Shmuel, we would have to learn Hilchas Melicha. And Melicha requires X amount of melach, and Melicha will not only accomplish the goal of removing the dam, but it also it preserves the meat. So if you put on enough salt that it would preserve the meat, then we apply the principle of Moliach Harehu Kiroseh. Okay, then, so we're up to Hahu Bar Gozla, and that's where Mitzvah Shem will pick it up tomorrow. Everyone should have a great day.